Hello everyone, it's Richard Reeser here, General Secretary of the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum. I'd like to welcome you to this, our 8th afternoon seminar on the theme of disabled children and young people. And we're very pleased to have with us today the Commonwealth Children Youth Disability Network, who we've worked with and in fact have 2 places on our executive, including Jonathan Andrews, who's going to be speaking to you in a minute. And we're also pleased to have Parmi Dusina here, and who's both the co-chair with Jonathan of the CCYDN, but also runs her own organisation, Include Me Too, which has done work for many years on including disabled young people. And we hope to be joined by Joseph Migilia from Chivata in Tanzania, who's also on the executive of CCYDN. And we ran it this morning. We had a few technical difficulties. We hope it's going to be better this afternoon. So take it away then, Jonathan. I'm going to share the screen now, and then we can do that. Okay. Right, so people should now be seeing that. And I'm going to go on to the first slide. Okay, Jonathan Andrews.
Great, thank you very much, Richard. So as Richard mentioned, I am a co-chair of the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network, along with Parmi. And just really to give an overview of who we are and what we do, CCYDN provides a platform for disabled children and young people to connect, share learning, develop skills and knowledge, and to advocate and influence disability rights, inclusion, the Convention Rights of the Child, and the Convention Rights of Persons with Disabilities implementation at national, regional, and global levels. CCYDN provides a strong voice and a platform for disabled children and young people, strengthening their voices, increasing representation and recognition in their roles as key agents, change makers in achieving disability rights, equity, and a better future and inclusive futures for all. Cut the next slide, please.
Sure.
Thank you. I'll just give a brief overview quickly, just as to the kind of the general background of the whole history of CCYDN. So the importance of the role and the input of disabled children and young people is, of course, enshrined in international human rights treaties like the CRC and the CRPD, but often in practice, children and young people have been excluded from international human rights forums and disabled people's movements. And a crucial element to supporting the inclusion of young people's networks and forums is to work alongside DPOs, NGOs, governments and stakeholders to recognise and support the innovation and development of methodologies and tools that are developed by disabled young people to support human rights and social justice and listen to their voices. A group of young disabled people came together and sort of formed a number of different documents, including the Global Disability Children and Young People's Charter. And this formed with Include Me Too to become the Commonwealth Children and Youth Disability Network. And just to give a brief overview of some of the work we've done previously, CCYDN officially launched with a disabled young people's delegation, an official side event organised with Include Me Too at the United Nations Conference of State Parties in June 2019. And then that the network's members have represented and presented on behalf of CCYDN on platforms including ECOSOC, the Queen's Commonwealth Trust, the South Asia People's Forum, CDPF, which of course we partnered with and sit on the collective committee, Disability Inclusive Forum, United Nations, Davos, and several official Commonwealth functions. We've also worked with Include Me Too on the COVID-19 hospital communication passport, which we should hear a bit more about later on, and also been involved in the Ideas Capacity Building Programme and Masterclass series, which was delivered during November 2020 to March 2021 and was in fact oversubscribed, and CCYDN was able to accommodate 125 young people with disabilities to take part. So that's really just a brief overview of the work that CCYDN has been doing. In particular, looking at this session today, this module is really focused on disabled children and young people's rights and participation. So firstly, we look at a human rights framework which supports and protects the human rights of disabled children and young people. Second, we look at the impact of stigma, taboos and discrimination on disabled children and young people's rights and interventions. Third, we look at the Global Disability Children and Young People's Charter, which was drafted by the CCYDN, and the inclusion of children within that is very important, as CCYDN is not only the first disability youth official Commonwealth network, but also the first to really focus on children in that way. Also then looking at the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, the agenda and disabled children and young people, looking at COVID-19, disabled children and young people, and the chance within that, and the need to advocate for the protection of rights and the different challenges that have arisen through that. And then finally, the role of disabled children and young people in the human rights and disability movements. So that is an overview of what we'll be covering today. I wanted to turn to Parmi to discuss the first section.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you everyone for joining us. Human rights are fundamental. They're fundamental rights of every single human being. It's about the basic needs to live, survive, develop, thrive, and have the right to be safe and treated with dignity. When a young person's rights are violated, they've been denied the basic human rights, and they've been treated as less of a human being. The human rights are being denied. Human rights are for everyone, therefore disabled persons. And the reason we're having to highlight that, because for so many, there are so many years of experiences that we're all sharing collectively. There's still barriers and challenges. There's still violations to human rights of disabled children, young people, and adults. It's so important that human rights are supported and protected and acknowledged by disabled children and young people and their communities around them, their caregivers, and all, in terms of society just generally as well. And one of the things that we're going to be kind of covering as we're going to go over it is about the human rights framework, how it works. And the one element that I'll be really focusing on as well here today is the United Convention Rights of the Child. I think we're all aware of the United Convention Rights of Persons with Disabilities, but how do they work together? And you'll see they're very complementary. So the slide that you're seeing, you can see there's still so many disabled children and people are still left behind. They're on the periphery of society. There is an estimation of 180 to 220 million youth with disabilities worldwide, and an estimation of 93 million disabled children, of which nearly 80% of them live in developing countries. And they are the most disadvantaged groups. And furthermore, with youth with disabilities are further disadvantaged. And there is some information in the course book that accompanies this presentation, this module. Next slide. Thank you. I think we all, we agree with this in terms of UNICEF's statement and the observation that we just highlighted how marginalised and excluded disabled children are, and the day-to-day facing of discrimination and being limited of the opportunities and choices and being able to have the chance to thrive. So this slide, just quoting it, children with disabilities are one of the most marginalised and excluded groups in society, facing daily discrimination in the form of negative attitudes, lack of adequate policies and legislation. They're effectively barred from realising their rights to healthcare, education, and even survival. And you can read more about this in the course book. So next slide, please. So we're going to focus now on the International Human Rights Framework, and about how we can work collectively and what these tools are there to able to assist us in terms of holding the human rights of disabled children and young people. So in terms of disabled children being left behind, we know that they are disproportionately impacted and also has a huge impact on their life chances. We know that they are disproportionately likely to live in poverty, also disproportionately vulnerable to physical and sexual abuse. And the mortality rate for them is extremely high. And children with disabilities are almost 4 times more likely to experience violence than non-disabled children. And also in terms of their value of their life, you know, their value of life is not equal to other children. So when there has been murders and killings of disabled children, there's a defense of mercy killing, and it just really dehumanizes the whole treatment of disabled children and young people, which is an experience that is shared in the disability community. And 90% of disabled children are across the developing world have no access to education. And the violations continue on their rights. 68% of girls and 30% of boys with intellectual or development disabilities will be sexually abused before their 18th birthday. The United Nations Convention on Rights of the Child was adopted in 1989, and it's extremely significant because it cannot be overstated, as it was a landmark. It was the first time it was placing children and disability in the international human rights law and field. And this is also a treaty that ensured children's civil, political, social, cultural, and economic rights, and more so, respecting them as key agents of right holders, and respecting them as, you know, in terms of they have the right to exercise those rights and their participation. In United, one of the key articles for the main principles that underpin the United Convention on Rights of the Child is non-discrimination. It's in Article 2, and that is key because, once again, in the Article 2, it highlights, it advocates and says, no disabled child should be discriminated. And then it's also in Article 3, the best interest of the child. Every child has a right to their basic needs, and they should be fulfilled. The right to survival and development is enshrined in Article 6. And Article 12, the right to be heard, to be listened, to be able to express their views and feelings on the things that matter to them. Next slide, please. One of the key slides of the United Nations Convention on Rights of the Child is Article 23. And this kind of is very, and this, we would certainly say that with Article 23, this is not, you know, it's not the fact that it references disabled children, that's the only article that's applicable. All these articles under the United Nations Convention on Rights of the Child are applicable for all children, including, as we said, disabled children and people. But Article 3 really kind of brings to the fore about the right of disabled children to enjoy a full and decent life, which includes participation in their communities, that includes them accessing and receiving education, training, healthcare, rehabilitation, preparation of employment, recreation opportunities and also, and also the fullest possible social integration and individual development of disabled children. And it also recognises their rights to their cultural and spiritual development. At this point, we're going to pause and play a video, a slight, this is a great video that is done by children and people, and it kind of gives you a little bit, kind of covers a few of the points I've just covered regarding the Convention on Rights of the Child. Thank you, Gemma.
Numbers alone, children are central to the world we live in as they make up a large and important part of society. Investing in children is both an opportunity and a duty.
It is an opportunity because the gains achieved through better nutrition, healthcare, education and protection are likely to be far greater and longer lasting than those in almost any other area. And it is our duty because children everywhere have human rights from the very beginning of their lives. These rights include the right to survive and develop, to be protected from violence, abuse and exploitation, to have their views respected, and have actions concerning them to be taken in their best interests.
These rights are found in a number of treaties and international standards, most importantly in the 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child, CRC. The CRC matters more than many people imagine. For one, in recognising that children have rights, it becomes the government's responsibility to respect, protect and fulfil these rights, rather than an optional act of charity or kindness. The CRC binds governments to a set of internationally accepted human rights articles that must be followed. This means that people who work for the government must consider and apply the provisions of the CRC in all aspects of their work affecting children.
The CRC provides a way to monitor government's progress on children's rights and a basis for children's organisations, advocates and children themselves to argue for change. Full implementation of the CRC goes a long way to ensuring that each child's entitlement to equality, dignity and respect is upheld. There's been a long-standing focus on protecting vulnerable children as a charitable response to suffering. However, at the start of the 20th century, some activists started promoting the idea that children should have rights. In 1924, with the aftermath of the First World War, Eglantine Jebb and others campaigned for the first International Declaration of the Rights of the Child.
During the International Year of the Child in 1979, Poland proposed that there should be a convention for children. Over the next decade, countries around the world debated and negotiated the text of what would become the most widely supported human rights treaty the UN ever produced, the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child.
The United Nations is an international organization committed to maintaining peace, security, and promoting human rights. One of the ways it does this is through international human rights agreements. The CRC is one of these and sets a global human rights agenda for every person under the age of 18. It was recognized by nearly every UN member state in 1989 and is now the world's most ratified human rights treaty.
Okay.
Thank you. So that kind of is giving you a bit of an insight, and it's incredible that it is one of the most signed up treaties. And this is also what we want to see for the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, because it's key, and it is actually starting to has picked up huge momentum and significance in terms of disabled people's movement. It is about enshrining our human rights and seeing ourselves as right holders and equals and valued citizens within society. Now, prior to the CRPD, the existing United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and United Nations Convention on Rights of the Child, even though they considered the potential and the protection of the rights of disabled persons and enshrined those, however, the real potential wasn't tapped in. The CRPD has been really significant, and it closed those significant gaps in the areas, both for development and human rights, to support the full inclusion of persons with disabilities. So, and one of the articles that really kind of highlights in terms of disabled children is Article 7. So Article 7 is explicitly mentioning disabled children and people about the dedication to ensure, it's dedicated to disabled children and people, introducing the obligations to ensure that they enjoy their human rights and their fundamental freedoms on an equal basis as other children. And also about, once again, emphasising the best interest of the child, but in this instance of disabled children and people as a primary consideration, and to ensure that disabled children have the right to express their views on the matters that affect them. And you can see already there is a clear synergy between the Convention on Rights of the Child. So this is building upon those momentum. Next slide, please. And there are several other specific provisions for disabled children that carry on in the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Article 3, to respect the evolving capacities of disabled children and the rights, and really importantly, to preserve their identities. And Article 4, children with disabilities must be consulted and involved when governments are developing and implementing legislation and policies that concern them. Access to justice, to ensure that they do have access and appropriate measures put into place to ensure that they can have that access to justice. Freedom from exploitation, violence and abuse, Article 16. Article 18, liberty of movement and nationality. And Article 23, which talks about respect for home and family, and Article 24 about the right to education, once again, build upon the momentum of the Convention on Rights of the Child. And then we've got Article 30 about participation in cultural life and recreation, leisure and sport, really putting in a key emphasis on that. And this, once again, really highlighted the key rights that should be afforded to disabled children and people. And one of the things we're hoping that you will see during this model in terms of your learning is reflecting on this. And in the course book, there is a table where, you know, you can look, we really want you to kind of explore, what are you aware of in your respective countries in terms of your laws, your policies? How are they really implementing the Convention on Rights of the Child and the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities? Is there some synergy? And more importantly, for yourselves to be aware of how those two are a key framework in terms of advocating for disabled children and young people's rights. And now we're going to go on to the next subject that we're going to cover, which is looking at the impact of stigma, taboos, and discrimination on disabled children and young people and rights. So we know that disability stigma and taboos continues to further disadvantage our community, our disabled community, discriminating against disabled children and young people, which really impacts on their early years, their early chances, their childhood. They're resulting in violations against their fundamental human rights. The superstitions, myths, beliefs vary from region to region, country to country, and amongst communities and families. And it does have a key impact on the lives and survival and development of disabled children and people. And one of the things in the course book, we do cover some of those areas. And I know that with the work that the Committee for Disabled People's Forum are actually doing as well, it actually has already highlighted that in the training that you had delivered. So you can see in this slide, behind the statistics, I think we all agree there's a denial of many of the rights of disabled children throughout the world, which is layered by attitudes which view the life of a disabled child as being less important, less potential than that of an able-bodied child. And there are so many barriers and challenges, from employment to friendships to education, to be included, to have the right to play, recreation, to family, that we see that gets played out in the lifetime of disabled children and young people. And sadly, as they grow into adulthood. Next slide, please. Just going to touch on a few of the things, in terms of the factors, what actually happens in terms of the impact of disability stigma that's associated to it. There's a lack of understanding and awareness regarding the causes of disability and their resulting characteristics. And it seems to be a key factor in terms of stigma experienced by disabled people. Disability is also usually blamed on misdeeds of ancestors, misdeeds of parents, mainly mothers, and misdeeds of disabled persons from their past lives, supernatural forces, demons, spirits, witchcraft or punishment or fate from God. Misconceptions about the causes of disability often result from cultural or religious beliefs. And misconceptions about disability are often reinforced by ill-informed and insensitive media coverage that perpetrates the negative views of disability. Now, we do cover that in the coursework, and we know that some of it's been covered in the other modules. But what I wanted us to focus on today, and what Richard has asked us to do as well, is to kind of explore what can be done in this part of this presentation. So we know that the impact of stigma, taboos, and discrimination on disabled children and people, in terms of their rights, survival, and safety, truly, as is in terms of Commonwealth Children with Disability Network and all of us collectively here, I'm sure we agree that it cannot continue being ignored. As they
Army, could you just slow down a little?
Sorry, certainly. As they do face a greater risk of violence, abuse, and neglect from their non-disabled peers. So in terms of what can be done, we've highlighted it slightly at the top, to challenge negative perceptions, portrayals, and prejudices, and strengthen the implementation of the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Safeguarding interventions are key as well, and about the legislation that underpins those to protect and eliminate disability discrimination, violence and abuse, and harmful practices. Disability awareness, disability rights, and the respect for rights of disabled persons also needs to be promoted and increased visibility for, and also increased access to ensure that it can really reach out to the wider society. What also would help is positive narratives, attitudes in the media coverage, the representation and portrayals of disabled people, and true representation to include the very people, ensuring their stories are shared, and they can be part of the stories and the media culture in a positive way. Grassroots advocacy and action, communicating messages on disability in a way that harmonises with local cultural values and activities is key, supporting community and faith leaders in roles to reduce disability stigma in developing countries. So in terms of addressing disability stigma, here's a few things that seem to that are actually happening. I'm sure that some of you may have examples as well. So I want to just pick on that. Advocacy and self-advocacy is so key. And in terms of our work, it's so important to ensure that there are role models are visible, helping also their peers to overcome the internalized stigma that they've experienced and changing the negative perceptions that might exist within communities. So certainly it's nothing about us without us kind of approach. The Leonard Cheshire Disability Young Voices programme, they reported that young campaigners with disabilities from Zimbabwe, who went on a speaking tour of 6 secondary schools, reaching over 12,000 school children, were able to change the way school children and their teachers saw disabilities. There's also a role for families. And in terms of their roles, it's that parents are being central in improving the perceptions of disabled children and in the fight against negative attitudes and discrimination. They play a key role to build the resilience of the child, their strong sense of their identity, their sense of belonging, in the face of the stigma that is associated with disability. The role of the family in tackling disability and stigma in developing countries have had 4 main strategies that seem to prove effective. Actively nurturing a child's development, taking the child outside the home and participating in family and community events despite the attitudes of others. The second strategy that seems to work is inclusion, for not hiding, not feeling that they can't take their child away, and really increasing their child's visibility and supporting their child to have the opportunity to get out to interact with others. And acceptance within the communities depends on the relationship people forge with their peers. So this is important. And about real inclusion, participation, a sense of belonging, which is so needed in schools, sports, and in all areas of community life and that child's journey. Information is key, combating and tackling the myths and superstitions that continue to persist, and they cannot carry on being challenged. So it's so important in terms of parents and carers sharing that information, advocating for the rights of their disabled child, sharing the challenges and barriers they have, working along with disabled people, learning from them, supporting their child, in terms of, and also working together for solutions and a positive impact for that child. Advocacy is very key, as you can see, in terms of improving provision of service inclusion. So it's about everybody working together, all the social actors, from disabled persons to self-advocates, including disabled children and people themselves, and the key people that they are, that are part of their life in terms of their families. Some of the DPOs have found that working with the communities, that they were able to transfer negative attitudes and harmful practices in those communities. So, for example, there was a study that was done by African Child Policy Forum in Ethiopia, and they found that the presence of active DPOs or disability inclusive NGOs at community level resulted in major positive differences in attitudes towards disabled children. Legislation also is very, very key. And so our advocacy work is so instrumental in ensuring that not only legislation is there, but it's been implemented, and more so the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the realisation of the rights of disabled children in this text.
Oh.
So under the Article 8 of CRPD, it articulates that fact that there needs to be, need to avoid and remedy harmful cultural beliefs and practices and prevent discrimination against disabled people. And just 2 final points. Media, as I think we all agree, is so key, and it's so important, a positive reporting criteria around disability. So in terms of the learning and in terms of your role about how that connectivity can happen within the media in these spaces where we can change perceptions, ensuring that you're part of that change. Without you, this change cannot take place. And it's very important to encourage and use, the non-discriminating, more positive and accurate language is so important in terms of reducing the stigma associated to disability. And one of the things that seems to work in some countries where they have more better access to radio, as a way of means of keeping connected and keeping informed. So radio broadcasts also have seen as being effective in many countries with where they have quite a wide audience that it can be reached. And that is a fantastic platform in terms of positive portrayal of disabled people, storytelling, drama, and reporting. And in all these spaces that I'm mentioning, it's so important of disabled people being in those spaces, being those key actors, not just focus, so not only are they visible, but it's about having those opportunities that they can also, not only focus on issues of disability, but be seen, so that positive narrative, that positive perception that we want, that we are capable and able. And then one of the key areas as well that's so important is reporting and documenting of abuses, proper reporting and real documentation against the abuses against disabled children, young people and adults. It's so essential if you really want to tackle stigma and taboos, and also to generate the advocacy strategies that we need to put into place to combat them and basically displace and remove the deeply rooted belief systems and the prejudices that we end up continually experiencing. And so that this level of persecution does not continue. So thank you.
So I'm going to do this activity now.
Yes, the next question. So throughout this, we're going to have 6 questions. We're breaking it down, as you've probably been used to these during these training modules. So question 1 is, wanted you to share 3 common negative misconceptions and attitudes in your country about disabled children and young people. So I'll share 3 common negative misconceptions and attitudes in your country, particularly you want to focus if you have in terms of disabled children and people. If you can put that in your chat box, as you have done. And I believe that Gemma, are you going to be?
Yeah, so we have a minute or 2 now for you to put that in the chat box, and then I will read some of the stuff out and then Parmi can respond. Okay, so they're still coming in. I'm going to start with the last one. In Nigeria, Akwa Ibom and Cross River states, disabled children are seen as creatures that are into witchcraft and nocturnal activities. Parents or families still hide their disabled children. Most schools are not still able to provide inclusive education for disabled children. Children with disabilities are cursed to their families. They're a burden. They can't attend normal schools. They can't go to mainstream school. They're special. They're a burden. They're hidden in houses. Misconception that their parents committed a sin that resulted in disability. the attitude they should stay indoors, they're a liability, they're embarrassment to family and society, that they are clumsy, slow learners or weak, that they're a curse, that they're a result of parent separation or sin, there won't be any value to society. Another one says they're hidden and thought to be useless. I'm just going to whiz down a bit. Including children with disabilities in play would hurt them physically, that their impairments are a direct result of witchcraft or punishment of some sort, that children with disabilities will not amount to anything and will be reliant on their parents or caregivers for the rest of their lives.
Exactly. Those are the stories that continue to come through from across the globe. The superstition, the hiding away, the superstition about being cursed, all the things that you've actually shared here, I think we've touched within the coursework, and in terms of some of the modules that the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum also touch on it. And I just want to say earlier, I think I mentioned Committee of Disabled People Forum. I did mean the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum. I do apologise, it's been a very long day. But in terms of so you can see the importance in terms of, I understand that, when Richard was saying it'd be really great when you do this presentation, Parmi, to highlight about what can be done. And that's what we need to focus on. There's an element of collating. We know this is happening, but I think also we're saying it cannot continue being unchallenged. And one of the questions, that we need to, in terms of it, how will we challenge that? How are we challenging it collectively? And also in terms of the countries that have ratified the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, what are they doing in terms of, increasing an awareness of disability awareness and, reducing the stigma and abuses and discrimination associated with disability?
Yeah, can I just add, Parmi, that?
Yes, certainly, Richard.
I mean, we're talking about 51 of the 54 Commonwealth countries have ratified the convention, and they've all of them have signed the CRC. So that is a really strong basis to challenge your parliamentarians about what are they doing on this. And I would urge people to think about that. The second thing is, it isn't that hard to find disabled young people who have become super role models, like Greta Thunberg, who probably is the young person that most people listen to. He's a girl with significant autism. And there are a number of documentaries around now about her and how she sort of just single-mindedly that's something we can all find other young people like that to actually push forward, to show that many of these myths are exactly that, just myths. Exactly, and just building upon that is so important, is the visibility. So even yourselves here, particularly those that are young people, and in terms of just all of you with your networks, it's how do we end up populating in the spaces the positive stories, and unless you don't hear about them, it's very hard to change people's viewpoints. So it's so important to to change the narrative, to have that peer support. So peer support for and role models and association with other disabled people, from for children, young people, for also in terms of families as well, so that they can also have that support. And it's really important when we talk about social agents, everybody has a role, a responsibility to support the duty bearers and support the right holders to realise these rights that we've spoken about today. There is a lot of work to be done, but as you said, it's not going to be remain. There's so much effort in trying to challenge this, and we need to really kind of band together and see and ensure we can do that. And so there is some actions that you can do, and I think within the course book there is an element where you can do a campaign, and if you are going to be doing a campaign, do share that with us in terms of the CDPF and also through CCYD, and we'd be really interested to see what you do as a result of what you're learning in this space. Well, I think we should go on to question 2 now.
Yes.
If you'd like to read that out, Parmi, slowly a couple of times, and then give people 2 minutes to answer.
Yes, definitely. So question 2, share 3 common positive perceptions and attitudes in your country about disabled children and young people. So that is up to 3 common, or or just generally any positive perceptions and attitudes that is being shared and highlighted and you're aware of about disabled children and people in your country.
Okay, and we'll be quiet for 90 seconds so you can get those into the chat. So Gemma, what have we got coming in?
So more inclusive schools are springing up. They're just as expensive though, and mainly available to elites. So there's more awareness on disability discrimination. These aren't quite the conceptions. Let me see. Some community in Nigeria have this renewed belief that children and youth with disabilities are specially made so by God, that caring for them being economical and supernatural blessings. Maybe it's not quite what you're looking for. Government support and media change the mindset about children and youth with disabilities. Genius, blessing, special. Okay, here's one. School have started introducing sign language interpreters to the academic structure. Most DPOs and CSOs have found a common ground to advocate for inclusive education, and government have seen the need to join forces to make this work. That's in Nigeria. Somebody in Namibia, the question 2, there is more of an understanding that disabled children can learn, and therefore schools are mainstreaming disabled children, and there are a variety of schools specifically designed for specific disabilities. Disabled children are human, just like other disabled children are unique in their own individual way and are trainable, should participate in activities and decision making. More and more people expect disabled children can attend mainstream schools. Paralympics has promoted disability sports. Positive attitudes. Children have rights and are to be protected. Children with disabilities serve as a reason for people without disabilities to seek higher education in the medical field. We have more young persons with disabilities stepping into disability advocacy space, especially with access to social media. This is a positive measure. Somebody said that their children with autism are not weird, but they're a rare gift from God. Children with learning disabilities are the ones to be thought to be geniuses, thought to be children with divinity. Yes, it's kind of a mix of things there.
Okay, certainly there's, as you can see, there's such a long journey ahead of us, but I'm sure that we're all happy to rise to the challenge. There has been, in terms of positive perception and attitudes, it's also about, so in terms of how they've been portrayed, and in the spaces, whether it be stories and films, etc. And what I wanted to say that when usually there's media coverage, language doesn't play, that language can actually, if anything, further cause the very much of the pity and the charity model. But I just wanted to share an example. Over the pandemic, there's, about young people, just as people were fundraising and trying to do things in their community, there's some really great portrayal of disabled children and people doing some phenomenal fundraising, reaching out, friendships. So there are some, and also about sport, we talked about sports stories, but it's also about the advancement of technology, about disabled children and people also being innovators and also being solutions about things that are needed, that generally society, really can do with. So in terms of positive perceptions, we do really need to move forward. And and this is why with this, with module, it's very much about disabled people being valued as right bearers, and about what they actually contribute in terms of family life, community life, school life. And it's so important that they, we need to ensure that we do provide and carry on advocating for inclusion, visibility, and ensuring that they can thrive, be safe, and also be supported to their development and reach their full potential. And because they're not given these opportunities, that is why that narrative seems to be very limited. And I think we all, it's about us continue that advocacy to show what the potential of disabled children can be, with all their different abilities and whatever small or large measures they make in terms of their, themselves, their communities, their families, and wider society. Every life is precious, and everybody is a human being and should be treated so with respect and dignity. Thank you for that feedback.
Tami, if I may, before we go on to Joseph, who I believe is on, that we need to be careful. One of the long-term stereotypes is that sort of disabled people are super achievers, and there were some of those or achieve better than everybody else, the children of God and all of that stuff. We need to be careful about that, because that isn't true. and
Yes.
they're not. And that stereotype is the other side of the coin of thinking that disabled kids can't do anything. So that if
Exactly.
someone does something, everybody thinks, oh, amazing, amazing. The reality is disabled kids can do all sorts of things and have always done so, but when the barriers are removed, can do much more. And we need to be looking at removing the barriers rather than seeing the issue about what's within the child. We must assume that all disabled children and young people have the potential to thrive, but what's stopping them is the barriers in our society, and we need to really focus on that. So that, I would say, we need to look at those comments in that light. Thank you very much, Parmi. So is Joseph with us now to carry on?
I think it's Richard. I think it's Jonathan first, and then
Jonathan first. Oh, sorry, my mistake. Jonathan, over to you, Jonathan.
Thank you.
I'll bring up the next slide for you.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah.
Thank you. So now I just really wanted to give a bit of an overview of the Global Disability Children and Young People's Charter. And this is something that as a member of CCYDN and working with Include Me Too, I played a big part in drafting. So it's something that is very important, and the intention of this charter to support disabled people's rights is obviously something that we all hold very dear, all who are on this call and who are presenting today and taking part. So as an overview, disabled children and young people representing 23 countries, 20 of which were Commonwealth countries, took part in the Global Disability Summit in 2018 in London. Include Me Too facilitated this and supported the facilitation of disabled young people to lead, participate and represent on the international platform. And through civil society, young people's workshops, online surveys, youth-led Twitter discussions and global video campaigns, participants' views were collated on the 6 themes of the Global Disability Summit, the changes they wish to see and what matters to them the most, the challenges and barriers they experience in regards to their inclusion and being listened to, how they want to be included and can contribute, and their suggestions for a Global Disability Children and Youth Charter. And the really key development of this was gathering those contributions from disabled children and young people across the globe. And this has developed into the Charter, which has 12 commitments to protect the rights of disabled young people as requested by those young people, to provide support and resources, increase inclusion, access to opportunities, live a full life with many possibilities, achieve their goals and achieve their full potential. And this charter underpins the UNCRPD Convention of the Rights of the Child and the SDGs. And the aim is to strengthen the rights and the inclusion for disabled children and young people by aligning the actions and support gathered to the Charter alongside those commitments made during the Global Disability Summit in 2018. So these are commitments such as inclusive education, participation and representation, gender equality, which is very much important within that discussion around disability and disabled people. It's not a separate issue, it's all intersects, and it's really important that we make sure that our advocacy around disability is also inclusive and gender equal. Safeguarding and ending all forms of abuse and harmful practices, inclusive and accessible communities, digital technology, economic empowerment and employment opportunities, which is a big focus of mine in particular, giving people that chance to be able to do the jobs they want to and use those skills in the ways that they are best placed to, not pigeonholing people or sort of stereotyping them, but allowing them to have that equal playing field with non-disabled young people. Also removing stigma and discrimination, support and well-being, humanitarian crises, legislation and policies, which obviously is what's been sort of spoken about previously, and actually ensuring that there are those rights within the law so that all citizens, disabled citizens within those countries can rely on those and utilise those. and commitment to the use of data to support the rights of young disabled people. And we have a few quotes from individuals who've been part of this disability charter. And just to give one, because I know that we'll obviously be able to keep to time, but just to give one, for example, from Anna Lucila Arellano from the International Disability Alliance, who's the IDA chair, who said, "I support the Children and Youth Charter of this Global Disability Summit because I believe that inclusion is a must, is urgent, and is now. And especially because I think and I believe that our children and our youth deserve a fair and equal, and especially an inclusive world." So that's just a bit about that charter that the CCYDN and Include Me Too have been championing. Could I have the next slide, please? Thank you. So now I wanted to talk about the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 agenda and disabled children and young people. So I imagine many of you on the call will have an idea of what the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, are, but just as an overview, they're a global call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity, aiming to leave no one behind. But children with disabilities are being left behind in a number of core areas within this, such as SDG 1, no poverty, SDG 2, zero hunger, SDG 3, good health and well-being, SDG 4, quality education. So just to give some examples of that, there's a lot of evidence that's suggesting around zero hunger that children with disabilities are more likely to experience malnutrition. Studies suggesting that good health and well-being, children with disabilities are 5 to 10 times more likely to report serious health conditions than those without. Also a study by Plan International in relation to quality education, finding that disabled children are 5 to 10 times more likely to be excluded from school than children without disabilities. And several of the SDGs explicitly state that they cannot be attained unless persons with disabilities are really included, including Goal 4, an inclusive and equitable quality education and promotion of lifelong learning opportunities for all, which really focuses on that intersectional focus, and particularly in terms of gender, but also in terms of vulnerable individuals and those with disabilities. So it is an area where it's really important to ensure that the SDGs and the work that we do that is inclusive of disabled people. And at the moment, a lot of the efforts that are being made towards those, these same benefits haven't sort of been seen for disabled young people in the same way. And this is something that is really important to focus on trying to change. And inclusive disabled children and young people's participation is more than just engagement, but actually being treated as equal and important partners and advocates in driving change. So I think it's now a good idea now to move on to the activity that we had planned on this section. So I think that might be on, yes. So looking at what are the key challenges in your country that are experienced by disabled children and young people.
Yeah. So again, 90 seconds to 2 minutes, and we might take 1 or 2 people. I think we've got enough time if they make interesting comments just to comment on them, Jonathan.
Thanks. Okay, so we've got quite a few responses in the chat. Gemma, I don't know if you might be able to maybe go through some of those and maybe highlight a few that might be good to sort of focus on, as Richard
Sure.
says.
Sure. Okay, so I'm not sure, possibly Tanzania. Poor infrastructures as it leads to lack of accessibility to educational institutions, also being hidden away. Accessibility, lack of inclusiveness, not considered to even have rights. Access to education opportunities and quality education. Lack of access to infrastructures again, lack of inclusive education. Key challenges including accessing specialists to treat multiple disabilities and diagnosis. Lack of education for disabilities in South Africa. There isn't even recent data on this. The latest stats I found was for 2001 to 2011. That's 10 years ago. Discrimination in the workplace. I don't know if you want to talk to them maybe. Got majority of private schools are still not accessible to disabled children.
Is this still South Africa?
Yeah. No, sorry, that was a different person. A lot of people are saying inaccessibility and lack of inclusion. Many do not attend school. So I don't know if you want to get anybody to expand on anything. Poor facilities when it comes to education, somebody said.
Yeah, that would be interesting actually to see what facilities.
The poor facilities when it comes to education. Okay, that was Consolo. I think that's Edward. I think Consolo. Can you unmute and talk to us? Here we go. Here we go.
Hello, Edward. Do you want to tell us something about what you said?
We can't hear you, but I know you're not muted. So could you get a bit closer to your mic? Consolo, please. You try again.
Wrong one.
Ah, we can't hear you.
Can we go back to the person from South Africa? Because I've got a question to ask them as well.
Consolo, if you stop your video and your mic for the moment, and we'll maybe try and come back to you in a second. So somebody in South Africa, it was Nonhlanhla Ado Bakasa.
Yes, that's me.
Here we go.
Can you hear me?
Okay, yes, thank you.
Shame, Gemma, I know my name is very difficult to pronounce. You can call me Ado, that's my nickname.
For us British,
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, so I was speaking about lack of education or accessible education for children with disabilities in South Africa, and the fact that there isn't proper recent data on this. And the latest stats that I was able to find, trying to find out just how many children with disabilities are there in South Africa that are not in schools, is where they had mentioned 600,000 schools. And I mean, that is from data that is coming from 2001 to 2011. And like I said, that's about 10 years ago. And when policies are being made, like right now, I attended the NYD, which is the National Youth Development Agency, where they are working on a strategic plan. They spoke about accessible education for all for children, but disability was not mentioned at all. They put on a whole lot of stats, but nothing spoke about disability on that as well within the document. So when even strategic policies are being drafted and written down, disability was not even included. And I mean, this was speaking about the youth of South Africa, even in employment, you know, and it's just the problem is not even recognized or acknowledged. And that's how I feel about it. Lots of problems are acknowledged and they're trying to fix them. But when it comes to disability and the lack of access thereof, it's not even acknowledged. It's as if it doesn't even exist.
Did you know about the court case a few years ago in the Western Cape where there was a child with intellectual impairments that the school refused, and it went up to your higher courts and they insisted that the child did have a right to education, because the right to education has been interpreted as those who would benefit from it rather than all children. Do you know about that case?
I mean, I didn't know about that case, Richard, until you actually made me aware of it. And I've been trying to learn and trying to figure out how this can be, you know, and how this is lawful, especially coming from South Africa, who are so big on, I mean, human rights. We've got the best looking constitution ever, but yet still we still passing laws such as this, which is unacceptable.
A colleague who's also disabled, Professor Michael Stein at Harvard Disability Law Center, the case is written up on their website, and there's a lot of other useful stuff there about using the law to challenge. And I think some of us need to be much more up on that and using it. And that was an example in South Africa, but I think all of you could be looking at the law to challenge. That's your area, Jonathan. How do you see people using the law more?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes into being aware of the rights that are actually there. So, for example, in the UK, you know, as you'll be aware, Richard, there are rules that exist in relation to services and employers having to provide reasonable adjustments for disabled people. And I've just found quite often there's a real lack of awareness as to what that is, to how that stretches, and people often not actually knowing that they can even request something. So that's just in an employment sphere, but actually in all kinds of cases and in all kinds of jurisdictions, if citizens are not made aware of the legal rights that exist, that they can utilise and rely on to defend themselves, they aren't going to be able to do that. And I think that sometimes we have an assumption that, oh, it's the law's there, so that's great. But actually, if we're not telling people what it is, how they can use it, and how practically you do that to support yourself and others, then there isn't much that those people can do. So I think it's about making people more aware of what exists.
And one way that you can do that is you don't have to be a lawyer to take these cases. You can look at what the statute says, what the laws say, what the international treaties say, and then go to the Human Rights Institute in your country. And quite a lot of African countries and India, Bangladesh have human rights institutes who will take cases against their government when you can point out the breach of the law. So you don't have to just do it on your own. Like in UK, we've got the Equality and Human Rights Commission who've taken cases as well. Do you want to go on to your question 4 then, Jonathan?
Yes, we'll do that. So question 4 is to choose 2 commitments from the Global Disability Children and Young People's Charter. So the charter that we were just presenting on just before this, and to choose 2 commitments from that which you wish to support, and what action you plan to take or advocate for. So as previously, if we 90 seconds to provide your response in the chat.
I will put the charter things back up on the screen to remind people.
That would be very helpful, thank you.
Which 2 of those and what would you do to implement them? Okay, Gemma, do you want to have a look through the chat and tell us what people are saying?
They're still coming in.
Okay.
Could you just pop it back to the different slides while we do this, please?
Yeah. There we go.
Okay, so Stephen in Ghana said his pick is commitment 2 and 12. Lillian, Tanzania, inclusive education, advocate on accessible infrastructures and bringing down barriers like language barriers in schools to disabled children. Somebody else has said number 12, data collection, and also number 4, worst forms of child labour. I'm just looking to see if there's any specific action described. Okay, here we go. Kingsley, I think Uganda. Number 1, inclusion, and number 2, education. These are what I will support and what I see as being one of the most pressing need, as long with children and youth with disabilities are concerned. My first port of call will be creating awareness with like minds and with concerned stakeholders. Advocacy visits leaders or people in authority follows, etc. Somebody else says number 1 and 9. Bernardina says number 4. Sorry, that's question number 4. 2 commitments to support, including number 2 and number 9. I will participate in whatever initiative I can as a disabled person to educate myself and others about our rights for inclusion. I will support and advocate for the well-being of my clients that I work with to establish a meaningful place like in the communities of Belize.
Gemma, that's fantastic. And I'm also looking in terms of time as well.
Yes, that's fine.
Everybody's
I'll be quiet.
It's really great that everybody's looking at the charter. And one of the things we'd say is that in the course book as well, there's a link. So do sign up, do get your DPOs and NGOs to sign up, but also talk about these, promote these. This is about what's come directly from disabled children and young people, and for them to be recognised as social actors and be supported. And just to let you know, Richard and Gemma, sadly, Joseph is not getting a great reception. I think we did anticipate that. So me and Jonathan are just going to cover a couple of points on the last 2 areas. I'm just going to mention the COVID-19 children, disabled children and young people's statement and recommendations. During just as you can see on the screen, there's some logos of lots of some of the organisations that have stepped up and supported and endorsed this, and we're really delighted that the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum did the same as well. If you go on to the next slide, Richard, so because I'm just going to try to kind of summarise this.
There we go.
Thank you. So what I just wanted to kind of highlight was, just bear with me one moment. So what I just wanted to highlight was that disabled children and people came from, from DPOs, youth-led DPOs and NGOs. We came together with the Commonwealth Children Youth Disability Network and talked about their real concerns, as you can imagine, to do with the pandemic and about the barriers and challenges they were having. And they wanted to ensure that they were also being visible in the space where there was phenomenal work being done for disability advocacy, in terms of really highlighting the rights violations really during the pandemic that continued and continue for disabled persons. But it was so important to make sure that narrative, we talked about the narrative, haven't we, today? It's really important to have the narrative of disabled children and people about what was so important to them. So they shared their stories and what they came with. And once again, there's a link in the course book, and I know that it will be put on the website. They came up with some key recommendations. And these recommendations as references, each of these, they are referenced, which article of the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities each of them are advocating for, plus the Convention rights on the rights of the child, plus Sustainable Development Goals and the Global Disability Children and People's Charter. The recommendations talked about accessible education and learning, we know it was impacted, talked about health and social care, the importance of that, accessible information, social distancing and support and well-being, because obviously it's all about how do you make sure that disabled children and people do not get left behind in terms of their caregivers and having that support they have for their independency, etc. Participation and representation, that just because there's a pandemic doesn't mean that their voices and their experiences are no less important than any other time. the key barriers and challenges that young women and girls with disabled girls were experiencing. There's a whole element of safeguarding, protecting, disabled children and people from all forms of abuse and harmful practices. Because during the pandemic, we're all aware that it was very much heightened and extremely more, at risk. Then also about economic empowerment and employment. Youths generally are increasingly the highest population globally. And then when you look at disabled youth as well, and also about the impact of the economic situation on youth generally, and then you break it down to youth with disabilities, you can imagine it's looking very, very uncertain, and it's very much about increasing those opportunities. And whilst at the same time tackling the barriers and challenges they already experience. And the other element we've spoken about is stigma and discrimination. We saw how people were being treated and disregarded during the pandemic, and not being considered in responses at the time. And independent living, people's lives continue, and it's about supporting their rights to do so. So that was very important. And the other element I think that's been picked up today is data, where we really need to look at the data about disabled children and people, and disabled people just generally, is how can we really move progressively in society and within our country if we don't actually know what the population is and how it's been impacted. And then that all comes down to legislation and policy. So that's very, very key. So just a little bit of an overview on that, and I'm going to hand it now over to Jonathan.
Just to say that all of that is still very relevant. I think a lot of people thought, oh, well, COVID, that's in the past.
Exactly.
By no means. India, has massively higher levels than it had a year ago now. There's been a rise in different parts of Africa again. This hasn't gone away. And until everybody on the planet is vaccinated and has boosters, it won't go away. So there are big issues to be campaigning on.
Exactly, Richard. And the key thing as well was how visible the pandemic made, those disparities that we've been facing time and time again, and the intersectionality, so many things came to the surface during the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sure with the Commonwealth Disabled People's Forum, we'll be working collectively together to continue raising those, and with other partners and social actors. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Palmy. We have 10 minutes left, so I'll pass on. It's Jonathan now, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, there you go, Jonathan.
Thank you, Richard. So it's on the role of disabled children and young people in the human rights and disability movements. I will keep this brief and succinct because I know that it's very important that we fit all this in, and it's a very important area to cover. So as was previously been mentioned, and has been a big focus on this, children and young people often are excluded from those forums where the disability rights are discussed and decisions made and power held. And that's part of why CCYDN exists, in order to make sure that young people with disabilities are able to be part of that and to actually advocate for ourselves. Just a few other examples of areas that is really important to cover is empowering youth with disabilities in Rwanda, where an estimated 42% of young people are unemployed or underemployed. And the government's efforts to promote youth development and employment have not may have made some impact, but it's still, there's still that significant amount, and it's particularly problematic due to half the population being under the age of 20. And so UWEZO Youth Empowerment was actually set up by a group of youth, a cross-disability organisation whose mission it is to serve as a platform for children and youth with disabilities, that's been making great strides there. It's also important to remember Leonard Cheshire, Making It Count, the power of youth advocates in the disability movement, and the Making It Count project is focused on realising the potential of youth with disabilities by empowering us to see ourselves as experts of our own experience and bringing a deeper understanding of the challenges they face in selected SDG areas. So remember, going back to the point about linking to the SDGs, and also the European Disability Forum Committee, which was recognised and developed as a recognition of the importance of mainstreaming disability in all areas concerning youth, given that there's lots of evidence that young people with disabilities face the highest levels of discrimination and additional barriers in a number of areas of society. And the Youth Committee has a number of priorities each year, 2021's main priority being housing and independent living, which is, you know, not necessarily something, particularly in terms of housing, that somebody might instantly think is a disability issue, but actually many issues, you know, the issues that affect a lot of young people equally will apply to disabled people in many different ways, and particularly independent living is a very key area, and actually making sure that young people are supported in that as much as anything else is also really important. And finally, young people in the disability movement in Australia. So that's my overview. Thank you.
Now, I was just saying, the European Disability Forum, one of their great victories was because they've had conferences for the last 30 years. And long before the European Union adopted inclusive education as an overarching policy, they were pushing for it as their #1 demand. And so that, in a way, that's where youth has led the whole of the European Union in that direction. So it shows the power of it.
Yeah, no, it's absolutely fantastic. Yeah, as you say, it's sort of certainly been a long time pushing, and a lot of this has been developed over several years and generations, as you say. And then actually just to finish off on that Australia, similarly, youth-led organisations and campaigns and civil society groups have amplified those voices of Australian young people with disabilities, such as Women with Disabilities Australia, in recent years. So there's a lot of work going on the Commonwealth level, and CCYDN is very pleased to be working alongside a number of these organisations in order to bring this greater change. But it's good to see that there is a lot being done, because obviously there's a lot that needs to be done and a lot of issues that need to be sorted. So it's good to see a number of initiatives like this taking place.
Okay. Next slide.
Yeah, and it's just a short slide there about advocacy, not just getting to the table with a new set of interests, but changing the size and configuration of the table to accommodate a new set of actors. So it's not just fitting disabled young people into what's already there, but actually seeing what disabled people want and need and supporting them to be able to do that and to change the conversation as well, to recognize that. So that's, you know, those are really the key points there. And just talking about what's currently been going on. Thank you very much for that. And I think, Parmi, did you want to take on now for the next steps?
Yeah. There are some questions that I think, Richard, I think we're probably going to send over to the audience. I mean, unless, I think, to be honest, yeah, there are some questions. The questions that we'd like you to, definitely send across is, and once again, these questions are also in your course book, but it's so important about, getting to know, or do let us know about what, in your country, how are disabled youth being involved in advocacy and in the disability rights movement. It's so important to make sure that youth are being connected with other youth activists as well, so we can all work together. And it's also very important, I think, in terms of disabled children's voices as well. So definitely in question 5, well, in your country, how are disabled youth involved in advocacy and in the disability movement? This final question for this session today was to look at, and the question to yourselves is, if you are a disabled young person, how are you being supported in disability rights advocacy? And how are you being included to participate and represent on the issues that matter to you and your peers? We'd love to have your answers and responses to all the questions. And thank you for those that have responded today. And I think that's our final slide, I understand, Richard?
Yeah, you're on the final slide. And just while I'm putting that up, I would say, I think that the last questions raised some important issues. And I think with our 85 member organisations, I think we could be putting much more pressure on all of them to set up their own youth sections. So we should have some further follow-up on this, Parmi.
Definitely. And also, as we said, the fact that I think it's really kind of recognising the efforts to date, I think that Jonathan has actually highlighted. And that's what young people have said, when they've made efforts to actually set up networks and forums, you know, do work with them, do connect with them, do recognise them as allies as well, because I think all of us in the advocacy area know how much work goes into it, lots of hours, and it just makes sense that, you know, we build upon the efforts that already exist. So certainly in terms of this, do get in contact with the Commonwealth Children Youth Disability Network, you know, do get in, you know, and also with DPOs that have got young people involved, get them to connect. It's all about how we can share together and share those experiences and really kind of strengthen that voice. And I think what young people, so it's really acknowledging, I think this is the final slide that really is pertinent really to what's been like shared today as well. This is about really demonstrating and recognizing and appreciating showing that there is, you know, there is an effective and meaningful disabled children, young people's participation in society is being recognized. And, you know, I really applaud all the youth that are involved in the disability advocacy work, and I'm very honoured to be part of the Commonwealth Children Youth Disability and all the work that they're doing, and the young people who are running their own youth-led DPOs as well. You know, phenomenal work's been happening, and you can see that from the Global Disability Children and People's Charter and the COVID-19 Children and Young People's you know, Charter and Statement. Certainly, it's about nothing about us without us, and it's so important to recognise those efforts, and if anything, support those efforts and build upon those existing efforts, because there's quite a lot of work that still needs to be done in the sector.
Could I just ask that you read the slides out? Sorry, because I don't know that it was read, and people that are visually impaired. Oh,
yes, certainly. If you can put that slide back up.
I'll read them out as I've got it up on mine, but I've closed it. So the two, which ones do you mean? The questions? Is that?
Oh, it was particularly that last slide.
Right, the last slide.
Because I don't think you actually read it out. And it was
meaningful disabled children and young people's participation in society requires to ensure that they are aware of their rights to express themselves, engage and participate in decision-making processes on matters that affect them, and encouraging them to exercise their rights as active citizens to bring about positive change. And the second one was enabling disabled children and young people as rights holders, social actors, advocates, to express their views and opinions, to be taken seriously and be included in decisions, actions, planning at local, national, regional and international level. Disabled children and young people's role in the disability movement is critical and will impact positively for the future of disability youth human rights movement, while ensuring they can have a better future. So thank you both, Parmi and Jonathan, for a really thoughtful presentation today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in and remind you that the inclusive education presentation and course book go up tonight. There's lots of activities there, and a lot of what we talked about today was inclusive education, so it's a good bridge to the next module. And we will be looking next Friday for 2 sets of 90 minutes at lots of practice about making inclusion happen and what the barriers are. So it's all part of one seamless whole. And so thank you very much. And we will get in touch to see how we can also take this forward outside of this training. So thank you very much. And thank you everybody for participating. Thanks to the signers, the captioners, to Gemma and everybody else. So goodbye and thank you.
Thank you.